for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here. I've been here a number of times over the past 20 or 30 or 40 years. It's always fun. Always a great audience in attendance, and I appreciate that. I also want to thank Ari Guerrero for running this place kind of unexpectedly, and she's doing a wonderful job. And I want to thank Dennis as well for organizing this program. I think Ari deserves It's been a trying time for ECM, and everybody needs to throw their support behind the organization. What I want to talk about today is African Americans' 105-year struggle for racial equality at both KU and in Lawrence. And it's 105 years because I used to give a talk that went from 1865 to 1965, but as most of us know who were here at the time, 1965 to 1970s is a totally different story and needs to be recognized on its own merits or demerits. For African Americans, I think, the state of Kansas has always functioned on two levels. One symbolic and highly romanticized, the other harshly real, and I think truly unfortunate. In Kansas Territory in the 1850s and 1860s, during the struggle known as Bleeding Kansas, settlers fought against the enslavement of people of African descent, and in 1861, they voted to repudiate slavery and enter the Union as a free state. Some scholars have written that the Civil War began not in Charleston, South Carolina in 1861, but in Kansas in the 1850s. And I think that's true. One of the best known freedom fighters was a preacher and a warrior named John Brown. In Kansas, as the place where Brown waged guerrilla warfare against chattel slavery, represented the promised land of freedom and equality. And in response, the free people came to Kansas filled with hope. Once in Kansas, however, African Americans encountered the unrelenting force of the color line. But the sad fact was, I'm afraid, that many of the white people who came to Kansas at this time were diehard racists. Men and women who believed that blacks were inherently inferior and who were bitterly opposed to racial equality. Indeed, I think it's safe to say that this conflict between lofty ideals and racist realities has been the central theme of the African American history of Kansas. So what follows today is a view of Lawrence, Kansas, and also the University of Kansas from the perspective of African American history. As I said, covering a period of slightly more than 100 years, from 1865 to 1970, it portrays the struggle for freedom waged by black Americans and their white allies, and it details the discrimination, second-class citizenship, racist indignities, and even the violence and death which they struggled to eradicate. Almost from the beginning, KU was an important institution for the higher education of African Americans. The first black student enrolled at the university in 1876, and the first black KU graduate was B.K. Bruce in 1885. Upon Mr. Bruce's graduation, Lawrence's main newspaper editorialized that this was, quote, an event worthy of Kansas. Recently, the editorial stated, a college paper hailing from Virginia took the University of Kansas to task because colored students and all others are permitted to matriculate. The article went on, it seems strange to them that such a state of society can exist where a man can stand on his merit and receive recognition. It speaks more for the republicanism of Kansas than anything else that a colored man will graduate this year from our state university with honor and with the esteem and respect of his classmates. So this is one side of the story. But the University of Kansas, again like the state of Kansas itself, operated on two levels. While it congratulated itself on its racially open admissions policy, it also enforced a Jim Crow system of racial separation on campus. As KU's student newspaper stated in 1886, while every Negro, provided he has like endowments, is just as good as a white man and is equal to him, equality did not mean community. Between the two races, there were differences in temperament and in mental qualities. Indeed, between them was an impassable gulf. For this reason, the editorial stated, we do not desire to associate with Negroes, neither do the Negroes as a social class desire to associate with us. It seems a matter of mutual pleasure that the two societies should be separate and independent. So that's KU's student newspaper in 1886. In the late 1870s, exodusters flooded into Kansas from the post-Reconstruction South. And as they came, white hostility to the newcomers mounted. Kansas stood in the minds of the exodusters as both a beacon of freedom and a place where they could own their own farms. But whites saw them as subhuman invaders. As many of you know, especially the historians in the room, the years from Reconstruction to the end of Reconstruction to the 1920s comprised the worst of the Jim Crow era in the United States. The distinguished black historian Rayford W. Logan called this period the nadir, or the lowest point in the history of American race relations. And C. Van Woodward, the distinguished whites historian, labeled this the period of America's capitulation to racism. This was true for the North as well as for the South, and sadly, it was true too for Lawrence, Kansas. In Lawrence, Kansas, where in 1882, 3 black men were lynched. The victims were seized from the county jail by a mob of 50 white men and hanged by their necks from the Old Cog River Bridge. In fact, the dead men were still hanging there for all to see when the sun came up the next morning. The message for African Americans was clear: uppity blacks beware, or you might find a hangman's noose around your neck. Nevertheless, African Americans continued to matriculate at the University of Kansas, and in the 1920s, black Kansans at KU were joined by young black men and women from neighboring states. Since the universities of Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas excluded African Americans, black high school graduates from those states also came to KU to enroll. Still, again, admission to the university did not mean that black students would share equally in the benefits of campus life. Indeed, as the University of Kansas entered the 20th century, it became more and more racially segregated. And we think sometimes of history as everything is onward and upward and things are getting better as we learn and become enlightened and so on. Well, in this case, it really wasn't true. Life for blacks in Kansas and at KU was much better in the 1870s and 1880s than it was in the 20th century. And indeed, I said, as we entered the 20th century, it became more and more racially segregated. It's somewhat unclear why this happened, but I think one reason was the decline of KU and Lawrence's proud abolitionist heritage. We know about Richard Cordley, John Spear. They all died in the early years of the 20th century. I think Richard Cordley died in 1905. His wife was so bereft upon her husband's death that she walked into the Kansas River to commit suicide, but was saved before she could do the act. But I think that's one reason. These hardcore, very dedicated abolitionists were aging and dying. Most of the abolitionists from the days of bleeding Kansas were dead, and public memory of that tumultuous time was fading. Also at the turn of the 20th century, there was a resurgence of racism in all parts of the United States, exemplified by horrifying lynchings and race riots. During the era of the First World War, for example, there were bloody race riots, especially in Chicago and in 24 other cities and towns during what was called the Red Summer of 1919. Moreover, in the early 1920s, early to mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was on the march in America, including in Kansas, and unfortunately again in Lawrence as well. In fact, in 1924, the Kansas Klan held a statewide conference or conclave at the Bowersock Theater, what we now call Liberty Hall. The downtown streets were filled with the Klansmen's cars, and South Park was the site of a rally of hundreds of Klansmen. When I first came to KU, I met an African-American scholar, a very distinguished scholar of black populism, who had gone to KU, graduated in the mid-1920s, went to the University of Chicago, got a PhD, and became dean of the graduate school at Atlanta University, named Clarence Baycoat. He graduated from KU in 1926. He was here when that Klan rally was held in South Park in 1924, living in East Lawrence, boarding with a black family. He tried to figure out how we could get across South Park without encountering the Klansmen. But two men, one was a Catholic attorney, the other was a Jewish businessman, went to the Klan rally, went up to the Klansmen they recognized and said, "I thought you were our friends. How could you turn on this way?" Two very brave men. As I said, the increase in racism was painfully evident at the University of Kansas in the 1920s and 1930s, and it had the official sanction of the Chancellor, Ernest Lindley, and of his administration as well. I'll give you a couple of examples of how racism reigned at KU in the 1920s, 30s, and well into the 40s as well. For example, although the university had a swimming requirement for graduation, that requirement was waived for black students in order to keep them out of the pool. And when the university finally did relent and allowed black students to use the pool, it was only on the last day of the month. Later that day, the pool would be drained and then refilled for the enjoyment of white students for the next 30 days. Interestingly, this policy was changed in the 1930s when John McClendon, who became an extremely well-known basketball coach, but couldn't play basketball at KU, he went to see his mentor, James Naismith, and they contacted the athletic director, Fogg Allen, and John McClendon, who was a phys ed major, and later, and is now a member of the Hall of Fame of the College Basketball Hall of Fame and the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame, John McClendon again. Went to see Fogg and said, you know, I don't think there would be a problem if black students use the pool. I think you're exaggerating the threat. Why don't we try it for 2 weeks and see how it works out? So Allen said, okay, we'll try it for 2 weeks. So John McClendon told all the black students, stay out of the pool for 2 weeks. And then we'll have it, we can use it. And he went back to see Fogg Allen and said, we had no problem. The 1930s is kind of an interesting decade because things were taking place gradually, sort of undercover. But in the 1920s again, for example, the KU had a pep club, which was originally called the KU Clan, KKK, later called the KU Club, KKK. The members wore white sheets, wore hoods. They had a mascot, a bulldog, and he wore a white sheet and had a hood. Instead of a cross, the fiery cross over their heart, they had a jayhawk. And then during football games, again in the early 1920s, and this was a group that was praised by Chancellor Lindley, by Fogg Allen, by the Dean of Men. What a great pep club. Again, they're in their white sheets and their hoods. They would give out the programs at the football games. And then during halftime of the games, they would march up and down the field and do little fancy drills, I guess. And people would cheer. So that's the KU Clan in the early 1920s. There was an article in a magazine, I think called Leisure World, which had photographs of this organization, talked about their activities, and quoted the praise that they received from leading functionaries at the university. So that's the KU Klan, but in some ways it gets even worse. Black students in the 1920s and 1930s were barred not only from intercollegiate athletics, and they had played intercollegiate athletics prior to that, and black men at KU had lettered in football and in baseball. In fact, 3 brothers, the Harvey brothers, had all lettered in varsity sports in the 1880s and 1890s, but that began to change. It's hard to date the change. I think it really was in 1913, because in 1913 KU played Nebraska in football, and I think KU had maybe 50 or 60 black students. They came to the game dressed in Nebraska colors, because Nebraska had a black football player, a very good football player. They came in KU in Nebraska colors. They cheered for Nebraska, and I don't think I brought that with me, but there was a wonderful article in the Crisis magazine of the NAACP talking about this action as an action reflecting the self-respect of black students at KU. Barred from intercollegiate athletics, but also from the glee club, the band, and the orchestra, not to mention the debating team, ROTC, and the student council. Black students sat in segregated areas, usually in the balcony at concerts in Old Hoke Auditorium. Even the Kansas Union was segregated. White persons could sit in the Jim Crow section, but not vice versa. Furthermore, black students could not attend university dances. Black women and men could not live in the dormitories, which of course were funded by the public. And no white fraternity or sorority would pledge an African American. I don't think that's changed all that much in the intervening years, but maybe somewhat. There are other insults and humiliations as well. White women, for example, pointedly refused to use toilets used by black women. And a well-known history professor seated his classes alphabetically, whites first, then blacks in the back row. The city of Lawrence not only supported KU's policy of excluding African Americans from the dormitories, but even went the university one further. The city sought to exclude blacks from housing anywhere near the campus. This again is the city of Lawrence. Lawrence's official city plan for 1930 declared, "It is not best for either race that the Negroes should encroach upon white districts. There is no reason why areas adjacent to the University of Kansas should be used for Negroes, and such encroachment, like invasion, I guess, should be stopped." Well, of course, one reason for blacks to live near the campus would be the accessibility of the campus. More accessible for their classes and whatever they did do on the campus. Lawrence's town fathers, like Chancellor Ernest Lindley and his successor, Chancellor Dean Millott, were men of their times. In other words, they were racist. They might have been paternalistic racists, but they were racist nevertheless. Lindley resigned in 1939, and Millott soon demonstrated he was committed to the perpetuation of the university's policies of black exclusion from campus activities. In 1941, for example, Millott granted African American students $200 for their blacks-only annual dance. But this time, 2 black students protested, writing in a letter to the editor of the UDK that they would not be bought off, and condemning the university for excluding them from, quote, "the right to participate in intramural activities, the right to the use of the gymnasium and its privileges at convenient times, and the right to freedom of movement in the Kansas Union." They were only asking, they said, for what is ours by right. And they urged that, quote, "the shibboleths of democracy be given life and converted into a living, vital force to abolish Jim Crow on the KU campus." Clearly, as some of you I know remember, the times were changing. The Second World War had begun with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. Democracy, freedom, and self-determination hung in the balance in Europe and Asia, and the United States became the arsenal of democracy for the Allied forces. And in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I hope some of you have seen the wonderful PBS series on the Roosevelts, really quite incredible. And in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enunciated the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. They were noble goals to be fighting for, but many people, including KU students, both black and white, perceived yet another wartime goal, which was the eradication of racism and second-class citizenship at home. So at this time, in the 1940s, as the University of Kansas campus became part of the war effort as a training facility for the Army and the Navy, students on campus grasped the contradictions between the ideals for which America was fighting and the racial segregation that was so evident on campus. In 1942, an interracial group of Christian pacifists on campus formed a branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Their first target was the Memorial Union and its segregated seating policy, which the students charged placed dollars over democracy. Throughout this debate, both Lindley and Millott said, well, we would open up the union, but we'd lose money, because whites would sit with blacks. They'd cease going to the union for their meals, and we would lose money, so we can't do it. So in other words, practicing dollars over democracy. Chancellor Millott rejected the efforts of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, explaining to the Board of Regents in kind of a secret document that the group consisted of well-meaning but misguided students who were zealous, but he said, ineffective in the community. But Millott's rejection did not quell the movement for racial democracy. The UDK denounced racial segregation as analogous to fascism and said that KU, quote, did a good job of practicing what Hitler preached. I'd like to see that same sort of courage and determination on the part of the UDK today. We can always hope. One of the most outspoken correspondents on the UDK was Jim Gunn, whom we know as a distinguished writer of science fiction, professor of English at KU for many years. In 1943, he wrote from his Navy base, and again, this was for publication in the UDK. Who fights for freedom, he asked. Speak up for the humanity of the Negro, the Mexican, the Jew, of their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some of the soldiers and sailors also grasped the importance of what they were fighting for. What am I fighting for? Asked one cadet in a UDK editorial. What are you fighting for? Freedom. We fight for the freedom to live one's life as one chooses. During the war, students also protested the segregation of blood donated to the American Red Cross, which held that it was, quote, this is the Red Cross speaking, deemed inadvisable to mix Caucasian and Negro blood indiscriminately. It didn't have anything to do with blood types, but race of the donor. In a letter to the UDK, two students denounced this policy, asserting that, quote, it contributes to racial discrimination by imitating the Nazi theory of the Aryan Superman. And in 1943, a new all-student council was created. Its constitution stated that, quote, no regularly enrolled student shall in any discriminatory manner be denied the privileges of membership. And a new women's organization, the Progressive Women's Cooperative League, pledged to work for equality. Thus, when World War II ended in 1945, there was already a civil rights movement in place at KU, and soon there would be one as well in Lawrence. Its forces were augmented by left-leaning returning veterans. And in 1947, students organized a local chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Students living in the housing co-ops were activists in the CORE chapter, which staged sit-ins at local cafes and attempted to desegregate seating at local movie theaters. The history of these co-ops is very important, and some people have studied it. Deborah Altus, for example, wrote a wonderful dissertation. We tend to forget the role of these students, very liberal, very committed to racial equality, living in the co-ops. We know who some of them were: Paul Gillis, Helen Gillis, and others lived in these co-ops. And they fought again during the war and afterwards. Some of them went off and got PhDs, as Paul Gillis did, in chemistry from Berkeley, but came back to KU and continued to fight against racial discrimination. In 1948, the Congress of Racial Equality branch in Lawrence tested the segregation policies of 4 cafes nearest the KU campus. 26 people sat in at Brick's Cafe, including 8 blacks. The sit-in lasted for 3 hours before Mr. Brick phoned the football coach. And before long, football players began arriving and verbally harassing the protesters. When that failed to deter the protesters, the football players rudely carried them out and dumped them in the street. During the early post-war years, and again, some of this might be familiar, idealistic young faculty organized, protested, and provided moral and financial support for their student comrades. Some academic departments, such as chemistry, political science, and psychology, were deeply involved